breezy morning of September 3rd, 2022 in Calvin Castine at Bob Venne Park, just outside of the beautiful downtown Champlain and just outside of beautiful downtown Rouse's Point, smack dab in the middle here across the road from Northeastern Clinton Central School. We're here for an event we like to do annually. We probably weren't as faithful as we should have been the last year or so because of COVID and stuff, but we got a brief ceremony that we're going to hold here. It's remembering the British invasion that came through here in August and ended in September of 1814. We've got the American Legion Post 912, Color Guard, and Sons of the Legion. We've got some reenactors up there from the Clark McGoldrick families, and we are going to have Town Supervisor Tom Trombley and a special guest appearance by historian David Patrick. So, remembering the British invasion of 1814 right here at Bob Venne Park in Champlain. I'd like to welcome everybody to this, what we hope will become an annual event again. We're going to have a presentation here shortly by David Patrick, as I mentioned on camera earlier. Dewey Tavern and the Dewey property here is very important in our history, as David will mention, but I want to mention the Bob Venne Park committee that made all this possible. After Bob Venne, who so many North Country people knew, died 25 years ago in 1997, Jay Montpelier and Norm Bono got together and said, we ought to get some kind of a fund going and get a park in Bob's memory. So that's how this all began. We contacted Louis and Rita Biddard. We had some property on Prospect Hill Road that we thought would work out, but it turned out to be above our finances. But in the meantime, we had given them X number of dollars, and we came to a point where we knew we couldn't afford to buy that property. So Louis and Rita could have said, thanks for the money, see you later. But instead, they said, well, we've got some acreage here that we think is even more appropriate for what you want to do. And because it includes the Dewey family cemetery and the history of what happened here in 1814, we thought it was very appropriate. And we want to remember Louis and Rita Biddard and their generosity from the current owners of Dewey Tavern. I've got on my North Country Honor Flight gear because up this morning at 4 o'clock and headed off shortly thereafter to Plattsburgh for the 40th and 41st North Country Honor Flight that honors our veterans. And it's very important that this site right here remembers veterans, because the town of Champlain was for the most part founded by veterans of the Revolutionary War. So this place has a long history remembering the veterans. And I'm going to turn the microphone over to Town Supervisor Tom Trombley, who will say a few words and do whatever he's going to do.
Thank you, Calvin. And I'd like to mention that was our County Legislator, Calvin Castine, speaking. And we also have the American Legion Post 912 from Rouse's Point here. I'm very appreciative to have these gentlemen here today. And we have the Champlain Militia representing in period uniforms. And again, very appreciative of them. So thank you everybody for being here and attending this. And as Calvin mentioned, we're hoping to build on this and make this an annual event and include even more people next year as we grow this. So with that, I'd like to introduce David Patrick. He's going to say he's very good at the history of this and describing it, and I really appreciate David being here. Thank you, David.
Thank you. So I'll just give a few words about the history of Dewey's Tavern. Dewey's Tavern was built by Elias Dewey when he came to Champlain, 1797. He built the log cabin, which is behind his house. At the time, lived there for 3 years, and then in 1800 built the His main house, which you can see in the background, the house of Louis and Rita Bedard, it later became an inn because we're on the road here, the main road from Albany to Montreal. So starting in 1812, the War of 1812 started, June, and we had three American armies come up from southern New York, and they camped around in these fields here. General Henry Dearborn came here, James Wilkinson, Wade Hampton, three armies, and these armies actually invaded Canada on this road, Route 276, at the border crossing that we know today. And each army was repelled by the Canadians, the British forces. One big battle was at the Lacole Mill in March of 1814, and about 100 soldiers, American soldiers, were injured and killed. The injured were taken back to Dewey's Tavern and laid out in the log cabin, the potash house, and the main house, and a lot of the soldiers died. And when they died, they were buried right here where we're standing in what was called the Dewey family cemetery. The cemetery was a 1-acre cemetery that was laid out by Elias Dewey in the southern part of his field on his property. His first child had died 1812, so it was probably a very new cemetery at the time that expanded over time. But he had several children die here, and then there were many family members, extended family members, friends and relatives, like the Odells, the Newells, Hamiltons, etc., the Moores, and they were all buried here in the cemetery. And as I said, American troops were buried here too. And then, of course, if we fast forward to August 1814, the British Army came down. They camped in these fields here and in Champlain. They then marched to Plattsburgh, where they're defeated. Legend says the wounded were cared for at the tavern, and then the dead were buried here in the cemetery. So we know we're standing here at the cemetery. There were many stones here at the cemetery up until 1909, and then one of the Dewey descendants, granddaughter of Elias Dewey, moved the visible cemetery stones to Glenwood Cemetery, which are there right now. We can see them today. But what we found was, through archaeology work done with the Plattsburgh State Archaeology Department, we actually had a radar, ground-penetrating radar, and we found out that half the graves did not have remains in them. The other half did, the recently buried people. And so the reality is most of the Dewey family is still here in this field, and we know there could be up to 100 American soldiers buried here in this field. The remains have been seen maybe about 60 years ago, and gravestones have been dug up in this field and many years ago. So the remains are here. The question is exactly where. Some work has been done back in 2013, and I'm hoping to continue that work where we can actually identify the exact locations of these soldiers and the family members. So that's a summary of the history of Dewey's Tavern, as well as the cemetery here. The flagpole generally marks the location of the cemetery, but it's a 1-acre cemetery, so that's 208 by 208 feet, and I believe it's probably where the cars are and where people are standing in this bottom square, which is the southern end of the boundary line, or the lot that the Deweys owned. We're standing right near the boundary line for the refugee grant, which was laid out in the late 1780s. And so anyway, that's a history of Dewey's Tavern, as well as a short history of the cemetery that we have here. Thank you.
Thank you, David. And now I think we're going to move to the ceremony of the flags. Thank you, Commander.
Champlain Militia, attention, ready. Fire.
So again, thank you everybody for attending. I'm going to turn this back over to Calvin Castine.
I want to thank the militia for being here, particularly on relatively short notice, and for Legion Post 912 and Sons of the Legion. They were up bright and early this morning, and they spent the morning at the Oval at Plattsburgh Air Force Base sending off those troops, and so they put in a day's work already. It's important that we think about September 11th and the fleet that came by Rouse's Point and the shores of Rouse's Point. That fleet that battled in Plattsburgh came by there, and we have to keep remembering that. We have to look at these grounds and imagine 14,000 British troops marching out of here and heading toward Plattsburgh for that battle. They arrived here, the first scouts, according to Pliny Moore's journal, and Pliny, I believe, is a distant ancient relative of David Patrick. According to Pliny Moore's journal, the first scouts showed up here about 300 strong on August 28th. And when those troops were brought back here and treated, they didn't leave here till September 25th. So that invasion started here and ended here, and it took a month for that to happen. So it's more than just that quick battle in Plattsburgh. it was a month long here for the folks up here, and of course, being this close to the border, that War of 1812 was a traumatic situation for everybody throughout that entire period. So once again, thank everybody for being here. We'll haven't picked a date for next year, probably be September 4th or whatever day the Saturday falls on. But we hope to make this an annual feature and promote the history of the Northern Tier, particularly here when it does with the Battle of Plattsburgh and the War of 1812. Thank you.